Nation, welcome to Apollo's Water.
Thank you for having me.
So you know the drill. I've told you about the Fast Five. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
I don't know. I guess
Okay,
so. I guess I'm ready.
All right, here's the first one. When I travel, the item I need most is fill in the blank.
A phone charger.
Okay, that's a generic. Everyone needs that, unless you're honest.
Okay.
Give me another
The
one.
item I need most, a good book.
Oh.
Whether I will read it or not, I don't know. But I will always have it with me.
That's good. That's good. Cultivate good reading habits. That's good. Okay, I'm going to assume this one, and forgive me if I assume wrong, but I'm going to do this the first time I've ever asked this question. The best LaCroix flavor is, and why?
Lemon.
And why? Just because it's cleansing?
Yeah, it's just like simple. It's refreshing. It's not weird. It's not like I thought I was ordering lemon, and it was like pomelo or it was like, no, it was like limoncello or something. And I was just like, this is not like, it was like weird tasting, and I just wanted my lemon. So, don't go for the limoncello, go for lemon.
Oh, it's not that bad. It's not. I just had one just like the other day. It's not that bad.
No,
not my first choice.
I'll disagree with you on that.
So, what's funny is my wife is the one who started buying LaCroix, and she bought it because she didn't think any of us would drink it. Because that's like, if you're a mom, you buy stuff that everybody starts eating it. And so she started doing that, and then we all started drinking it. And she's like, I have to find a different drink that no one else will drink.
Our battle right now, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they always want to have sparkling water when we have sparkling water, but they insist on having it from the can. They do not want it poured into glasses, but they will never finish one. So we're always trying to figure out how to convince them to let us just split one between them. But the fun of it is having your own can. So
it is, but it's the not fun of having to clean it up around the house, because my kids don't ever finish them. Never finish them. Okay, here we go. Number 3. If I were a style of house, I would be what and why?
Anything with a big front porch.
Oh, so you like people. You like to have people.
I grew up with a front porch, and I'm a big believer in it. It's a good, I feel like they're very welcoming. Like they're really great for just sitting and hanging out. I also prefer them to back decks, because it kind of makes the socializing visible on the street, and you see your neighbors as they're going about their day and everything. Yeah, I'm a big fan of front porches.
So is my wife, but you can't find them very much anymore.
I know. It's really sad. It's really, really sad. Actually, anytime I see new construction with front porches, I'm like, yay, go, build more front porches.
Okay, question number 4. Funniest cross-cultural experience is what? What happened? Give one.
It's a long story.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, I lived in China for 2 years, and my roommate and I wanted to play a practical joke on one of our teammates. And they have these big outdoor markets, and they sold ducks. They sold ducks, live ducks, at these markets. And so our idea was that we were going to buy a duck, and we were going to give it to Ryan. We had a key to his apartment, and we were just going to leave it on his porch, and he would come home, and there would be this duck, and it would be this really funny event, and everyone would have a good laugh, because he'd have a duck. And what do you do with a duck? And so the perfect day came, and we thought, this is our moment. We had the whole thing planned out. And my roommate Talia went to the market, bought the duck. I was waiting by the apartment complex, and I see her walking up, and she just kind of has this funny look on her face. And I kind of looked at her, I was like, everything okay? She's like, yeah, I think so. And so we went upstairs and we got into his apartment onto the balcony, and we like kind of shake the duck out of the bag, and it just sits there. Like it doesn't move or anything. And we're like, well, maybe the duck's a little stunned. Like maybe like it's a little shocked. It doesn't know why it's here. And so long story short, we could see this balcony from our apartment, and we like watched for hours, and this duck didn't move at all. And we were like, we put a dead duck on Ryan's balcony. He's going to hate us. And he comes home, he goes out there, we see him like look at the duck and then pick it up. And then we like don't know what's happening. And we're just like, we have to run over there and apologize. So we, probably 10, 15 minutes pass. We get down to the bottom, and he's standing there. We're like, we are so sorry. Like, we didn't mean to put a dead duck on your apartment balcony. And he's just laughing. And he's like, well, it wasn't dead. The legs were broken, and it had just been like sitting there with broken. I know it's really, really sad, but apparently at the market, they assume you're going to take it home and eat it. And so they do the service for you of breaking the legs first. And so, but anyways, he said he came down and he didn't know what to do with this duck with broken legs. And he was just standing there. This old woman walked up to him and was like, are you going to eat that? And he was like, no, I don't know what to do with this. And she was like, I'll take it. And so he just like handed over the duck to her. And that is our story of how we thought we were going to play a really good practical joke on someone, but not knowing how the markets work in China, we ended up putting a somewhat dying broken leg duck on his porch. But it turned out because a very sweet old Chinese grandma got a duck for
a free
dinner
duck
that night, a free duck for dinner that night. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So it was a weird story. It was a weird day.
And now it's immortalized forever.
Yeah. Now the whole internet gets to hear about our weird duck experience.
Duck experience. But those are the stories that help make life interesting. The things
sure.
we did. So just as funny, I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have these little tractors that my father was a mechanic, a diesel mechanic. And one year I come up into my office as a pastor, and there are these pictures, like, how I used to go and get them developed, and they were sitting there, and there's a note, and it says, "Dear Travis, I couldn't take it any longer. I had to go on vacation." And it's one of my students had taken my tractor and traveled around the United States taking photos of the tractor, and it was like commentary. It was like, this is me at the Grand Canyon, and this is me in 4 states.
Amazing.
Like, it was so funny. Those kind of practical jokes I'm all for. Those are the ones that are like, that's
well,
funny.
when they work out, I mean,
yeah. That's the problem. When they don't work out, it doesn't go over.
It would have been
well.
a better story if we had a live duck waddling around his balcony for the whole day.
This dead duck with broken legs. Poor duck.
I know.
Okay, number 5. If I were a store, the store I would be is what and why?
I were a store, the store I would be is, I don't know, I'd probably either be a bookstore or I'd be like a travel agency.
Why don't you do both?
Okay.
A bookstore and a travel agency.
Two dying things, travel agencies and bookstores.
I like that though. Yeah, you don't see too many travel agencies anymore,
no,
do you?
I know. I'm sure they're probably still out there. They probably just moved online more, but yeah. I mean, I feel like when I was a kid, you'd walk by them all the time, and you don't really see them anymore. So.
The bookstores, that makes me super sad.
I know.
When I see bookstores closed, that does make me sad.
It's like front porches. They need to be brought back.
They do. They do. Well, speaking of books, let's talk about your book. Now, it's very full cover, and you can see it's been a lot of reading. Actually, one of the pages fell out, so I'm like serious. I am so serious about this book. I've got notes all over it. I am out. I'm down.
That's incredible.
I am committed to this book because I saw the cover and it struck me at first, going, okay, this is a very interesting cover, and I couldn't figure out though who wrote it because it says Wang Yi and others, and then it's like, well, Wang Yi's in prison, and I'm like, wait, well, who wrote it? And then it had you edit it, and JT Eddie, how do you say it? Sing?
Yeah.
Sing. Okay. Faithful Disobedience: Writings on Church and State from a Chinese House Church Movement. I know that many in our audience are going to probably wonder, why are we talking about this, and why is this such a big such of importance? But it really is, because we see what's going on in the global church. We've heard a lot, and I know just our normal churchgoer has heard about the church exploding in China, but it's a whole lot more than that. So let's jump down into this. Let's talk about the Chinese House Church for a moment. What is that? Because you are the head of the Center for House Church Theology. So let's talk about what those two things are for a moment, why they're important.
Well, the house churches in China have existed since the 1950s, when the communists came to power. And, I think from probably most people, most churchgoers, they've heard something about a house church in China. But I think for a lot of us, what it is and what it means is kind of hazy or kind of murky. I think, before I got involved with all of this, I definitely would have thought of house churches as, hiding in small little, apartments and trying to make sure people don't know they're there. And that is part of the house church's history. I'd say there have been stretches in the history of the house church where that's been true, but that is not necessarily always the case today. The house church is a lot more complex than that. It's a lot larger.
No, let's do it. Let's do it.
And most Christians in China today are part of house churches. So maybe a quick history lesson. Because sometimes that's helpful. So, essentially, Protestant Christianity has been in China for a lot longer than people might think. The first missionaries went into China in the 19th century. And in the first half of the 20th century, there actually were pretty significant revivals taking place across China, and a lot of growth in the Protestant churches across China. Even before the communists took over, a lot of those churches were very familiar with suffering and very familiar with persecution and hardship, because in the first part of the 20th century, Japan was aggressively, at war in China, taking over large parts of China. And the Japanese were pretty harsh to churches in their territory. And then, of course, you had World War II, and immediately following World War II, you had the Communist Revolution. And so a lot of those churches from the early 20th century more or less went straight into the conflicts with the communist state. For a lot of them, though, it didn't necessarily feel like something new, because they'd already been dealing with conflict with authorities, with Japan and with other rulers in China. But the communists, I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about Christianity in China is thinking that the communists at all times in their history of power in China have wanted to eradicate all religious belief in China. That's something that I think kind of in America, we think, you know, oh, all the communists want to get rid of all religious belief or faith in God. And that's really not always been true. When they first came to power, the Chinese Communist Party did not insist on closing all churches or ending all religious practice. What they wanted was to ensure that all churches and all religious practice in China was submissive to the communist state and, you know, able to communicate their allegiance to this new government. And so they started a state church, which has a name which I think usually strikes a lot of English speakers as kind of a odd name. It's called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. It's less odd sounding in Chinese, but basically this is just a state church. It's a church that ultimately comes under the authority of the government and the Chinese Communist Party. And the kind of ask was very simple. The ask was that all Christians in China and all churches in China participate in this state church. And what created the house churches was that roughly half of the Christians across China refused to enter the state church. They refused to participate in it. And essentially their argument was that only Christ is the head of the church, and they couldn't accept a state, you know, political authority over the church's life in China. And so in the opening decades of the Chinese Communist Party, there was a lot of persecution of the church, a lot of very harsh persecution that lasted basically into the 80s. But the church really persevered through all of that. And then in the 80s and certainly 90s and early 2000s, when China began to open up and a lot of these restrictions relaxed, there was just this huge revival, a massive revival across China. And so today, you know, estimates are, it depends on whose research you read. The more conservative estimates are that there are 80 million Christians across China. Bolder estimates put it well above 100 million, which is huge. I mean, that's a huge number of brothers and sisters in Christ. It's also a significant percentage of the Chinese population at this point. And so it's a church that we really ought to know more about and ought to pay more attention to, just numerically on one level. But what they're saying and what they're thinking about and what they're writing, I think, adds to that need to hear what they're saying. So I'll pause there. I know I just gave this very long rambling
no,
history
it's not
lesson.
It's not rambling. I just don't think that many people are familiar with what is going on. They don't understand how the government is trying to take over the church and create their own church in the process. Mm-hmm. So that's really that's really the issue that's at the core with Wang Yi, as I've read, and we're going to get into him in just a moment, is because the government wants to place itself above the church and wants to direct and appoint pastors and bishops. Even when I was reading about how we read within Roman Catholicism about how Pope Francis is now, they've really brought back ties together, but there's still bishops that the government is appointed that he's now recognizing, which is crazy to think about. Really is crazy to think about. This just shows how powerful they are. So we've talked a little bit about, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, you know, kind of the meat of the question from the early days of the house church, because I think it can be easy for us to say, oh, you know, how could any Christian ally themselves with the Communist Party? One of the things that I find very interesting about that whole time period was that I think a lot of the motivation from early guys who allied with the Communist Party was they felt like that was the only way for the church to survive. And I
Mm,
think there's a really important question in there of, if you were in a position where you thought the only way for the church to survive would be to ally myself or compromise in terms of the who's at the head of the church, would you do it? Or would you trust that it's the Holy Spirit who keeps the church alive no matter what the circumstances, and refuse that allyship, and I think that's where, it's I highlight that because I think we often think like, oh, we would never ally with the Communist Party, but if you thought that was the only way to keep the church alive, you might be tempted to do so, and so that's where your understanding of the church and what makes the church is really, really important.
well, I think you bring out a very good point, because honestly, I'm not sure if any of us in the West could even conceive of that, because for many of us, we've been birthed into an environment of individual rights, of individual
Mhm,
expression, of freedom. We've not had this oppression. We might approach it in a very patriotic way, an independent way, but when your every aspect of your livelihood is being threatened, the loss of job, and I say this now because people
mhm,
are not speaking out on a variety of issues in the West because of fear of litigation, loss of
mhm,
job, being
mhm,
canceled in the culture. There is an aspect of the persecution, but it's more of a soft rather than a
mhm,
hard persecution.
mhm,
And this is why I find the work and what the church, what's happening in the church in China is very interesting, because on one level, it's a rebuke
mhm,
to what I see going
mhm,
on in the West right now. And even reading Wang Yi's words, knowing this man is going to prison, it had a very Bonhoefferian ring
mhm,
to
mhm.
it, and how he went about it. But let's get to him. Let's talk about Wang Yi. Who
Yeah.
is Wang Yi?
He is probably one of the most well-known house church pastors in China today. He's, I would say, one of the few house church pastors with name recognition outside of China, for sure. Um, and a lot of that was due to his arrest, which I'll talk about in a minute. Um, but I think even before his arrest, a lot of people had some idea of who he was. And part of that is just he's a very, very talented guy. So before he became a Christian, he was a human rights lawyer and scholar. And he was also a very avid writer. He was very active on the Chinese internet, very active, writing on various prominent blogs, and he had a pretty large social media following, and um, he is a really gifted writer. I think he's very winsome in his words. He's really one of the things that I think is interesting is, it's not easy. It's not easy to be as interesting a writer when you're translated as I think
Mm,
he is, and so I think that the best writers are the people who are interesting to read, whatever language you're reading them in. There are a
mhm.
lot of people who in their own language are quite compelling, and when you translate them, it loses some of its vitality. Um, but he became a Christian later in life. He was already, established as a thinker in China when he became a Christian. I've tried to think of, what a kind of a parallel would be. I think it would essentially be, if some name, someone who wrote for, say, the New York Times, um, you know, became a Christian very publicly.
Mm.
That's essentially what it would be like, and we haven't really seen that happen in the US in a long time. Um, so this is someone who, was already a recognized thinker and scholar and intellectual who became a Christian. Very quickly after he converted, he began pastoring. Um, He became a Christian essentially through his wife. She became a Christian first. And then they very quickly got involved in Christian ministry, and he became a pastor. They are in Chengdu, which is southwest China. So, it's not on the coast. In China, the coastal cities are really the kind of big, prominent leading cities. And the further west you go, kind of the more it's, less less elite, you could say. But Chengdu is kind of the leading city in southwest China. If you like Sichuan food, that's where Chengdu is. All the good spicy food in China comes from that area. And so they started a church called Early Rain. It had a few different variations of the name, but its official name now is Early Rain Covenant Church. And they were a very public house church. So they're everything that is not what we might imagine of a house church. They met publicly. They were very prominent online. They really were not hidden or hiding in any way. And they sought to be very engaged in their city. I don't think I mentioned this anywhere in the book, but for example, one thing they would do is every Christmas, they would have a very large Christmas concert, essentially, in a large rented venue, and invite anyone to come to it. And they grew to be very large. In 2018, when Wang Yi was arrested.
Is that how you say it? Wang Yi?
Yeah, Wang Yi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wang Yi. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. They had probably about 600 people attending. And they had planted multiple churches across Chengdu. And they also were involved in starting a lot of different Christian education initiatives. So, again, this is not a small hidden thing. This is a very socially and publicly engaged expression of the church in China. So, as the book highlights, though, that of course created conflict. That was a decision that they felt very led to, but it definitely created conflict with the governing authorities. And I think especially, up until 2018, the trend had been increased openness for the churches in China. They were not the only church that large. There were, several churches in coastal cities and places like Beijing or further south in Southeast China that were just that large or even larger. And it had seemed like that was going to be the continued trajectory for the house churches. There were several house churches that were trying to kind of broker a middle path with the government, basically trying to argue that, they could somehow register with the government without submitting to the state church, the Three Self Church. But in 2018, at the beginning of 2018, a new set of religious regulations began to be enforced. And this, is ongoing today, and it basically has led to a pretty significant increase in persecution of house churches across China. Wang Yi's arrest and the crackdown at Early Rain was a really significant sign that a more difficult time for the churches was coming. It was kind of a big, you could probably say it was a big show of power on behalf of the state. And it was a very big event. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to go into the details of what happened in the arrest.
This is really good stuff, because I still think some people are trying to fill in the blanks on what's going on and why the church is being persecuted in China right now, especially after there had been, so as you mentioned, their restrictions were lightening, they were opening. He comes along, public convert, very notable name, comes to faith in Jesus, and then becomes really outspoken against the government. What was the impetus behind? Okay.
Part of it is just personality, part of it is, I think he's a thoughtful guy, and he was a public voice before even his conversion, and even a public voice on matters that touched on matters of the house church. Again, he was a human rights lawyer, so he came from a background of being pretty aware of a lot of the dealings of the Communist Party in China and violations of human rights issues in China. So, I don't think he dropped those interests after his conversion, for example. But I think, he really believes that the church is the greatest gift that can be given to the city, And I think this comes out a lot in the book, especially, the closer you get to his arrest in the book, the more this just is on his heart. And so he talks about how when governments interfere with the church, that's a travesty, not because it inflicts suffering or difficulty upon Christians or churches. It's a travesty because it limits those outside of the church from hearing the gospel and having access to the preaching of the word. So I think that his motivation in speaking on these things is, he's driven by a belief that what Chinese cities need are the church, and anything that prevents the church from being able to serve their cities is a problem. It's it is a wrong that's being done against the population of China to prevent them from hearing about Jesus. So I think he's very adamant in several places that he's not in this to fight for rights. He's not in this to kind of stake a claim and fight for it. He's in it out of a desire to see the gospel spread across his city and across China.
Reading about him and reading his writings became more convicting as it got closer to his arrest. It seemed to you do a good job, and I'm not sure what you wrote, and I know it says you edited it, but how was the book compiled? Well, actually, let's go back. What brought about your interest in this subject?
Okay.
That's a better question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. So I've worked with China for almost 20 years. I first went to China as a college student in 2005 and never thought this was going to be the trajectory of my life. But the Lord has kind of just kept me in it. And it's a real honor to have been doing this. But yeah, so basically I worked in ministry with Chinese students, both in China and in the US for a really long time. And then about 10 years ago, I was recruited by an organization that works with house churches across China. And they basically came to me and said, these guys have so much to say. They have so much to teach us. We really believe that, as much as we are working to help equip them, they have something to say back to us. They have a lot to be teaching those outside of China. And so I always like to write. And I think I had like a personal blog, but I had been working with Chinese for a long time. And so they asked me to start a blog for them. And I did. And we had a lot to figure out. It was it took a long time to figure out how to find the right people within China to work with, who wanted to write, who wanted to have their thoughts, shared with the rest of the world. And we had to start a translation team, which they are the not unsung because I sing their praises all the time, but they are the real heroes of the work because no one wants me to translate large materials or large quantities of Chinese material. But we have this just incredible translation team, and they work really faithfully, using their gifts to help bring content out from China. So we had started this, we'd had some success, and a mutual contact got in touch with me and said that Wang Yi had compiled this House Church manifesto, and he wanted it to be translated and shared with those outside of China. And I had very little faith at that point, and I thought, I don't know how to do that, and I don't really know, who would be interested in this in terms of publishing. And we kind of had to just sit on it for a while, but we kept translating other pieces of his and other content from him. And then essentially, after he was arrested, we thought, well, this is just done now. This is not going to go anywhere. But in 2020, we had a conversation with IVP, and they were really interested. And so we were able to move ahead with compiling this book. And so how this worked out is I compiled it, and I'm the one who wrote all the introductions to the different sections. And my co-editor, JD, is the one who really helped with most of the footnoting, especially concerning points of Chinese history or Chinese culture. And so it was a really good partnership between us to be able to help contextualize this book for a North American audience so that those who don't understand China or know a lot about China can pick it up off the shelf and have what they need, I think, to be able to dive into what Wang Yi is talking about.
I thought you did a really good job of bringing that out, because even when I read Aikman's book, and it's been, I don't know, maybe 20 years, you helped us to see the issues that were at work with the three self movement, and bringing out Wang's writing and why that was important. Because I remember reading Aikman's book, and he was much more sympathetic to it then, and people getting involved in it, and Wang's not. He's not at all sympathetic, because he sees it as really a compromise, compromising the gospel at its essence, because it's the government that puts itself over Christ rather than Christ being the head of the government, and it's restricting their movements. It's appointing pastors for them. They're much more skilled in socialism and really interpreting everything through the Bible through this lens. And as it went on, though, reading his words, and it's not just him. You have other writers that are in here too. Jen Tianming.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah.
Pronounce it for me.
Yeah, Jin Tian. So it would be Tianming, Jin Tianming. It's kind of like, think of it as like Jen.
Gene. And then I see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other people, I think, that you've cited besides Wang. these are all leaders within the house church movement.
Yeah. So the first third of the book, that is the manifesto that Wang Yi compiled, and that's his writings with writings from these other pastors in Beijing. And essentially they wouldn't all agree on everything, but they have a lot of consensus between them on the house church's relationship to the state church. And so they worked together to compile this. And then the next 2/3 of the book are compiled by myself, consulting with various people who knew Wang Yi, know Wang Yi, and were able to help say, yeah, these are the most important writings that can be included.
So you set it up with the House Church Manifesto. Then the part 2 is the eschatological church in the city, and he does talk about that. Then you move into the arrest in the way of the cross. Why did you develop that thought process that way?
Well, I think it shows the development of his own thought a good bit. Part of it's just chronological. The manifesto, he compiled that before the next 2 sections, or the material that's in the next 2 sections. But I think it helps to show how he is increasingly moving from thinking like a lawyer to thinking about things from the perspective of really a pastor and a theologian. And so, I know I just said, he maintains he's not fighting for rights. One of the things that I find really interesting is in that manifesto, in the first third of the book, he actually does have sections where he talks about the need to fight for rights. But then by the end of the book, especially in my declaration of faithful disobedience, where the title for the book comes from, he changes that opinion, and he says very strongly, this is not a fight for personal rights, and this is not a fight for the rights of the church even. I wanted to show development in his thought and how he's, progressed and evolved as a thinker, and especially how just his understanding of the church and the nature of the church, if you want to throw a big word out there, his ecclesiology, how that has really begun to influence his ideas on the purpose of the church, this whole question of rights, and how that's just been shaped more and more by his understanding of the church, and especially the end destiny of the church, and this question of where are we going. It is a huge theme in his writing. And that's not unique to Wang Yi. I would say that's a huge theme among many pastors who are writing and thinking in the house churches today. This question of, the eschatological question, eschatology, that influences their thoughts so deeply. And that's another big word, but really all it means is the end times. How does our understanding of where we're going influence what we do today, and how we exist as the church today?
There's so much that he talks about. Like, I just in the chapter, he says history is Christ written large, and he talks about dreams. And he says here, 10,000 years are too long, so the world is trying to seize the day and the hour. All the dreams of this world have to be fulfilled before death. But Christ left for us is more than 10,000 years, and he loved us before the common era. The cross has shattered the curse that all the dreams have to be fulfilled before death. I mean, that's just like, he's really going after this idea that this world is your home. He's saying no.
Yes.
And yes. He gets into this. There's one part. Oh, this part, 184. He says, I said to him, according to the scripture, he was talking about the blood of Jesus and this official that was getting ready to arrest him. I think that's what it was going on. And he says, I must tell you that the Communist Party will pass away. All of the powerful emperors and the political powers established by them in Chinese history are part of the cycle. But when the Communist Party passes away, the church will still be there. And this is the part, right? I mean, wow. The church will always exist. Why? Because the peace established by the blood of man is short-lived. Only the peace established by the blood of Christ lasts forever. Whether you believe it or not right now, let me ask you, isn't it better? Isn't it more agreeable to your conscience and doesn't give you more inner peace? I was like, what? Like, I felt like and I know he's writing to the Chinese background. He's writing to the Chinese church, but there was so much, even when he gets into the how do you say it? Sinization?
Yeah, sinization.
Every word I'm mispronouncing, Hannah. Every word. What? Say it again.
Sinusization.
Sinusization. So I feel like I'm in Nemo and I'm trying to say sea anemone. Sea anemone. Sinusization. Sinusization.
Just skip it.
No, I need it. I need to know it. Because the principle is so important to me. It's really just how it's syncretism. It's taking Christianity and making it. It's trying to remove it from the Western influences that they seem to be attached to it. They see it as a Western religion. Chinese officials do. So they're trying to strip it down and make it so that it's subject, or actually not just subject, but buttressing Chinese cultural values. Right? Am I right in that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I see C.S. Lewis used to talk about chronological snobbery. When you need to read stuff outside of your own time in order to critique your own cultural moment. I think the same is true, that there's like a geographical snobbery. You're shaking. Okay, tell me, you're ready to go. I can tell you're like
finish your thought, because you're saying it beautifully.
Well, so. I think that there is this idea that it's a rebuke to our current Western cultural moment, because you're seeing how the gospel is played out in the face of hostility. And I kept looking at it going, our persecution's not the hard and fast overt persecution. Ours is it's the difference between being lulled to a spiritual sleep by the carbon monoxide of secularization. It's that slow death where we're addicted more to our comfort. And I'm reading him, and I'm reading about his arrest, his wife's arrest. I'm reading about all these elders writing and trying to encourage the church. They knew full well what was going to happen today. And he said, let me see if I can get this quote here, because he talks about, he prays more people would lose their jobs. I mean, he prays more people would suffer. He's like, because they don't want to become like the West. They want, not that they're asking for this like masochistic, like beat me, but it's saying that the more the church is persecuted, the more it's going to grow. The reason he even said the Chinese church right now is in a spiritual lull.
Yeah.
And he's hoping for a greater persecution to wake him up. And I'm like, can you imagine saying that now in the West?
No. Well, and I think that they're like, and I think one of the really important things that like has to be kept in mind when thinking about that is the growth of the church in China. Because like if he says that and there's no like backing up of the fact that the church is still surviving in China, then like it's an empty statement, right?
Yeah.
But like he says that, and I know of many churches, many house churches in China who, when persecution increased in 2018, when all of the difficulty of like COVID-0 has unfolded across China, their response has been to lean into church planting. Think about how many churches and church plants we saw fold in the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I know many churches, I have a personal friend. He came to the US for seminary. He went back right before COVID broke out, and his church plant was supposed to launch the week of the Wuhan lockdown. And he didn't know, what to do. They abided by all local restrictions and policies. And a year later, on their 1-year anniversary, they had 100 people in their church and they baptized 10, And I think that's just where I feel like our understanding of how the gospel moves is so small in the US, like we limit our understanding of how the gospel grows and how it moves by saying that it has to have openness and it has to have money and it has to have material success in order to be able to say that the gospel is free to grow, But like the Chinese that I know, like they feel like it's the opposite, pressure is what causes the church to go out and to serve in their city and to meet actual needs and to preach the gospel. And
he talks about that. He says, you're a group of master ballet dancers performing at a landfill. And he quotes the whole Joshua Bell story, which I remember when that came out. I remember using that story. I actually just used it where I was speaking the other day, but he says this statement. He says, however, this is part of the meaning of the landfill, for God has allowed them to be ambitious because he wants to magnify the value of faith. In general, the more terrible the performance environment, the greater the eschatological meaning of the church's show. So he's basically saying is the more worse, the better, the worse, the more the environment is, the more that important it is of how we live. This is the part that I'm trying to figure out, though, for the West. We're not suffering the hard and fast persecution by the government, not in that overt way where people are being put in prison for going to church. I mean, I know people said, hey, we're meeting as COVID and that's what we're doing. That's different. They're not banning you for religious reasons. They were banning you for health reasons. It's a totally different expression. And I know people can debate that all day long, but people are meeting now. You know what I mean? Their restriction, because I actually had someone tell me, they're like, is my religious rights being taken away? And I'm like, you're still able to worship. They just want you to wear a mask. It's a general health concern. Again, I'm not trying to get into that. I actually think that has a whole different connotation of why people freaked out about the masks. We do a lot with neurotheology on here, and there's a lot of conversations about that in reading the facial expressions on feeling part of a community. And I think that's a bigger issue out there at play. But talking about this has made me wonder, because I think there was an article that just came out the other day. They were talking about, again, another article highlighting the mass exodus of younger people from Christianity. And they're talking about secularization. And I know everybody's trying to identify why. And that's part of what we do is we're saying that secularization is actually a part of it, but the church doesn't address it because it's individualized it and privatized it and made it much more of a self-help idea rather than the understanding of who Christ is and what it means to be a part of his kingdom. How do we, though, do you think, in what you know of what's going on in the Chinese church, I mean, what principles do you hope are transferred over for the church to wake up to in the West because of this, because of what he's writing, because of what the church is standing for? I mean, what do you hope comes from this?
We need to have a reframing of our concept of what the good Christian life is, and our understanding of what we are pursuing when we call ourselves disciples of Christ. And one of the things that the pastors that I work with talk about, and it's still deeply challenging for me. I would just everything in me as a comfortable middle-class American would react against it when I first heard them talking about it, is that they talk about the Christian life as being one of inevitable suffering. Being a disciple of Christ, you will face suffering in your life because Christ himself suffered.
You mean in
And
China? You mean in China? Or are you talking about here? Oh, okay.
Anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because Christ is our master, and the servant doesn't, rise above the master.
Right.
And his life on this earth was marked by suffering. And therefore, we anticipate that we also will live a life that involves suffering. And I think for me, when I first was hearing them say this, it just is like, well, I don't suffer, like, am I therefore not a disciple? But the more I've thought about this, the more I think actually what this shows me is how weak my understanding of suffering is, and how weak my understanding of suffering as part of my discipleship is. And I think that Americans are allergic to suffering.
Oh no, that's going as a clip on YouTube, Hannah. That's it right there.
We are deeply allergic to talking about it. We're deeply allergic to experiencing it, and it's made our theology of it incredibly weak. And I think the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized, it doesn't have to be persecution for me to say that I am participating in Christ's suffering. Americans have lots of experiences of suffering. When I look at my friends, I'm in my late 30s, and we're now all getting to the point where we've all experienced some form of significant suffering, whether it's physical suffering, whether it's relational suffering, whether it's suffering at the hands of problematic churches, whether it's suffering from conflict, whether it's suffering, you could go on with the list, whether it's sometimes discipleship itself feels like suffering, sometimes the call to put sins to death in our life requires of us a willingness to suffer. I think a lot of Americans, and I say this because I see it in myself, we have a lot of ways in American life to try to dull the effects of suffering or to distract ourselves from it, and that's not to glorify suffering, and it's not to say that we should seek it out or go out and kind of try to be these like self-martyrs, but it does mean that I think we need to let the global church, which often is a much more acquainted and willing to talk about the realities of suffering, we need to let them disciple us in these issues, and we need to let them be the older brother or older sister in our lives. And we need to hear what they have to tell us about what following Christ requires of us in our lives, and what that will cost us, if there's no concept of following Jesus costing you anything, I think you have to question what following Jesus means in your life, because scripturally, I don't think it doesn't cost something, so I think that, that's one of the really big takeaways. I think the second thing is just, this question of, do we really believe that the church is the best gift we can give to the city? Do we really believe that the church is what our cities need? And do we really believe that it's worth the pain to give that to our cities? So yeah, I mean, I think there's so much, there's a lot that I could keep going on and on about with regards to what we have to learn from our Chinese brothers and sisters. But I think in general, just the ways that they challenge, I think, our American idea that you can be a disciple of Christ and pursue comfort and expect your life to have no discomfort in it is something we need to hear from them, and you can take that down to the personal level, and I think you can blow that up to the big kind of church level too. I think as much as we have to ask ourselves, in our own personal lives, how much are we letting, you mentioned Bonhoeffer earlier, but the cost of following Jesus, how much is that actually apparent in our lives? We got to ask that about the church too. Like, are our churches primarily, like, is the goal of our churches in America to just be self-sustaining and maintain the status quo and, have your nice Sunday service and that's the goal? Or are we really, as a community living sacrificially, and going to wherever the call of Christ takes us? I don't think you have to be persecuted before you're asking yourself how the church's existence is both blessing and challenging the assumptions of the city around you. You don't have to wait for persecution to ask that question.
It's interesting you mentioned that. He mentions this part on page 186 where he says, eventually all your actions are subject to God's final judgment. This has led the church today to continually psychologize the gospel and reduce the meaning of salvation to the healing of the heart. Now, right there, I can tell you most Westerners are like, wait, what? Wait, what else is it for? But then he brings it out. He said, it's very difficult for us to preach the gospel of the, quote, the one eternal power, end quote. On Christmas Eve, when we remember the birth of Jesus Christ, we can hardly even proclaim, behold, the government shall be upon his shoulder. Isaiah 9:6, something that Westerners don't know what to do with. They kind of just skip over it because we don't know exactly how the government is going to be. We can see that at the end of time, but he mentions elsewhere in the book, and I can't remember where it is right now, and I'd written down a lot of his quotes, but he mentions basically that, and going back to the quote I mentioned earlier, the more darker that is, the more important our role is. I think, though, in the West, it doesn't feel dark. It's hard to feel dark when you've got your nice 2 cars, kids are in school and all the athletic pursuits, and you're in church on Sunday. And again, I'm not saying that we have to go out and seek for persecution. I just don't know if we see the depth of the reality of what the gospel costs to people in other cultures, although our culture is shifting very quickly. And I think that we might become aware of it now. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say though, that I think, there's, I think you have to ask yourself too, though, like, is it really any less dark here? It might not.
Right.
Yeah. Like it might not. And that's what I mean by, like, it's so easy for us to distract ourselves with our comforts, like, yes, we aren't, our pastors are not being threatened with being put in jail. So yeah, on one level, for sure.
Yeah.
We would say, like, it's not dark here in the same way. Yeah. At the same time, how much are our 2 cars and our flat screen TVs and our comfortable houses just hiding the brokenness of our reality, and just kind of putting wool over our eyes of the darkness that is here, and I think that's what I mean by, like, all people are fallen, all people everywhere live in a world that is marked by suffering. There have been times and places where that gets, well, I don't know, it depends on how you want to view it. There are times and places where that might be more redeemed, or, God may bless a particular place. There may be more of a presence of the church, and it is actually brighter, But I think there also are times and places where we might just be fooling ourselves, like all of the glitzy things are just hiding a level of brokenness that we haven't really confronted or dealt with or confessed as the church. And I think, another big theme that Wang Yi talks about in the book that I think is very applicable outside of China is this question of allegiance, and what is your ultimate allegiance? What is your ultimate love in life? And, one way to put it is who's your king, who rules the desires of your heart. And I think this is where I think China and America are not that different from each other. In both places, materialism and material gain are really, at the end of the day, what rules all of us, and those are the things we need to repent of, and we have that in common with them. And, all of these pastors, they go write their sermons on laptops in coffee shops like we do, like there are some things that are very different about China. There are a lot of things that are very, very similar. And just the temptations and the kind of ways that Christians can be lulled into contentment by just the material, the materialism around us. So, that's one of the main ways that the Chinese Communist Party has succeeded in recent decades is by the sheer material wealth that China has accumulated, and so much of the bargain with their people has been, you keep us in power and we'll keep you materially successful and, ensure that you have a nice, stable life. And, I don't, again, we're not talking about, we are not living in communist China here in, 21st century America. But I do also think there are places in which Americans and American Christians fall prey to a similar bargain of saying, we'll keep our comforts and, water down what it means to be the church. So.
Well, I think you bring up a very fascinating point, and I'm reminded of the whole Aldous Huxley versus George Orwell, Animal Farm versus A Brave New World. In Animal Farm, or 1984, excuse me. In 1984, he imagined a Big Brother is watching, which we do have that, and he was deathly afraid of people banning books. And Aldous Huxley hypothesized a world where they didn't have books, not because they were banned, because they were so addicted to their pleasures that they wouldn't even be aware. I think it's a bit of both in our culture today. And this is where globalization and secularization, I think, has crept in ways that we didn't realize. And while we like to romanticize what's going on in the church, I was actually taken back at Wang Yi's conversation about how people keep talking about the church in China, but we're suffering in that the church is not as zealous and not as dedicated and zealous as it once was. And we need a revival here. And many, I think, Americans hear that and they go, wait, what? How could that be? You're in prison, you're suffering for your faith. But his thought was we don't have enough people that have lost their jobs. We don't have enough people who have been in prison. We don't have enough people that have lost their lives on behalf of the gospel. Oh, Lord, please let that be us. And I was sitting there going, I can guarantee you the opposite is the case here. Please don't let that be us.
Something I was thinking about earlier, you were mentioning, just, the younger generations and the loss we're seeing from the church of our younger generations. And they struggle with the same in China. They struggle to figure out how to raise the second and third generation in the faith. One of the things that I think about is, this comes down to, again, what are we saying the Christian life is about? Is there a cost to it? Is living the Christian life something that just means finding whatever will help you have a happy, comfortable life. Because if it is, then there are lots of other options in today's world that will tell you that it too can give you a happy, comfortable life. Or are we saying that what it means to follow Christ and be a disciple of Christ means something sacrificial, something that costs something that is working towards something bigger than yourself? That's not just about you, but it's about a bigger reality, and something that has to do with all of time and history, And I don't in any way consider myself an expert on why the American church is losing its younger generations. But I do find myself thinking we aren't giving them a real picture of what the faith is and what discipleship is. We aren't helping them see that this is something worth giving it all up for.
Well, I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's quote. I'm going to quote it because, as you mentioned that, I had to kind of just do a quick look on my computer because I'm writing helping write a manuscript for this other ministry, and Lewis said, "I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that." He said, "That's what I love about Lewis." Yeah, that's just Lewis. He's like, if you want a religion to make you really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity.
Yeah.
And it's true. It's this is the Bonhoeffer, the knock the Folge, the whole cost of discipleship. What are we willing to give up in order to gain? Or Jim Elliot, when he says he's no fool to give what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose. And so this is what I see with the Chinese church. I see, especially with Wang Yi, as he's bringing that out. And he mentions this in that third part of the book and again, I know that you put that structure on it, where you have the first part of the book. I'm going to read this, the House Church Manifesto, as he walks through he's giving a history of the Church of China, which was worth its weight in gold. Actually, it helps everybody to understand a bit more of the background and why he gets sent to prison, because you really have this compromise, the synchronization that's going on, where the government saying, okay, we'll give you God, but he has to be our version of God. And we'll give you the church, but it's our version of church. And we'll give you leaders, but they have to our version of leaders, because the Chinese culture is the top part here, and every value has to come in underneath that. And that's where he's saying, no, there's no way. No, that's not our purpose. And then he gets into that eschatological church in the city, where he talks about the cross, and then 20 ways that persecution is God's way to shepherd us. And I just want to read these really quick here, because I was like, wow, I'm not going to read all of them, but where he gets into, like, number 2, our fears show us the deep-rooted servility living in our hearts. The church-state conflict is a test revealing the slavish residue living in our bodies. Wow. I mean, again, this is, he does translate well across languages. Now, there was a few times I'm like, I don't know what he's talking about right now, because it's like some Chinese pictures, or what was just like a little
imagery.
Bit. And I didn't exactly to see it, but he says this is how the persecution is shaping us. This is the reason why we can't submit to this, because Christ is the one who's over history, and anything that attempts to do it over that, we're going to be faithfully disobedient. But he reiterates time and time again, give us the freedom and we'll follow. We have no problem submitting to the government as the state. Why is it so important that we keep this distinction? The two kingdoms idea. Why is it so important to keep that distinction in his mind?
Ooh, I wish he was here to answer that.
I know. And you've never met him, right? You've never met him. You're just familiar with him.
I've met him once in 2016. I went and was helping interview and film house church pastors, and got to film or record him. We have film, but we just use the audio of him It's a call to prayer for the American church to pray for China. It's really powerful. You can find it on YouTube. But yeah, anyway, so I've met him once. Man, his kingdom theology, as I would say, among the people I know who are moving into more academic scholarship of his writing, there's a little bit of a debate on, is he one kingdom? Is he two kingdom? Is he Kuyperian? Is he not? You got to have this guy that I work with come on. He's currently writing a dissertation on this very question. And I'm hoping that he'll be able to turn his dissertation into a book eventually, because he could probably answer this question better than I can. But I think at a basic level, again, I think what it all comes down to is the question of allegiance and the kingship of Jesus for Wang Yi. I think Wang Yi has read very widely in Reformed theology, and I am sure he has a very clear opinion on the kingdoms that he could share with us. But I would say I don't feel confident with what we have in the book to really nail him down on that whole conversation, because my opinion is that he kind of wiggles between them a little bit. Some of the things you read really, come across as a very, Calvinistic or Kuyperian kind of take on this question. And then some things you read and you're like, this guy's an Anabaptist. But sorry, this is a lot of me processing as I talk. But what I was getting to is that what is crystal clear about Wang Yi's thought is that what matters is the kingship of Jesus. And what matters is that he is very clear in his understanding that, Christ is the king of the cosmos. He is the one who ordains all authorities underneath him. As such, we are very much called to respect and to adhere to those authorities in every way, except for where they limit the church's ability to be the church. And this is, again, he's not unique as a Chinese pastor on this topic, even though he's very outspoken against the Three Self Church and the state church, and even though he's very vocal in his fights with the Communist Party, in all seriousness, I would say but for sure, all of the house churches across China, they're very serious about being good citizens. They're not trying to take an antagonistic posture towards their culture, I would say. They love being Chinese. They love China. Many of them, if you talk to them, they're not coming at you saying like, oh, China's this horrible place and everything that the government does is just the worst. They're actually, I would say, very, very faithful Chinese citizens. But again, the kind of one thing where they will, in Wang Yi's words, choose to be faithfully disobedience is this question of the limitation of the church being able to be the church, and with that, again, who is the king of this church? Who is the king of our world? And he's incredibly unbending on that issue. So
he is. I mean, he talks about, though, the way of the cross. That's part of his theology, and he says he mentions the emergence of Chinese urban churches on 192, and he says the emergence of Chinese urban churches over the last decade was brought out by God in a relatively relaxed environment. Our way of the cross, our suffering of the Lord, our grasp of the situation, and our self-evaluation have not yet been seriously tested by God. Therefore, we tend to overlook corruption and fear in the midst of weakness. Wow. I think, again, he has a lot of words for us to say, because our churches have grown up in pretty relaxed environments. But the stresses that we have are more political within the church than persecution outside of it. I mean, we're divided over a variety of different issues. And again, partially it's the fact that we haven't talked about embodiment and suffering and the importance of relationships. It's been very an individualistic, just me and Jesus kind of faith. And he actually counteracts that as well. He says, no, you're a part of this community in the church. What are his I mean, I would say, what are his thoughts on it? The whole book is really about that. I can't just say that part of it, because he talks a great deal.
Good moment to say, buy the book.
Buy the book. Buy the book. Buy the book. And in it, though, it is hard sometimes to hear and read some of it when you start reading about how the Chinese church has their only one publishing house to publish the Bible. Do they take out passages of the scripture?
They don't. It's a pretty faithful translation and a pretty faithful publication of the Bible. There's always the question of what the future holds, but so far that is not something that they've done.
Why is the government, though, so frustrated with the church that they have to make it obey? What's the fear? That they're going to be westernized and these Western values are going to creep in?
I think it really I don't think it's as much about westernization. It's really about, I feel like I keep saying this, so if I'm repeating myself, forgive me, but allegiance, it really comes down to, the Communist Party, its primary interest is maintaining its authority within China, and to do that, it requires the allegiance of its people. But I think any system which wants to maintain power the way the Chinese Communist Party wants to maintain power, you can't have just kind of a tacit acceptance of it. You have to have a continued investment in it by the people, and so I think essentially, and I think this is why the Communist Party has never said to its citizens, you may not believe in Jesus. There was a brief time in the 1960s and 70s during the Cultural Revolution where that may have been the case. But generally speaking, there's never been a regulation on someone's private individual faith. What is a problem is something that is a corporate gathering of people that gives those people identity that might supersede the allegiance to the Communist Party. And this is why, Christians are not the only persecuted people in China. Just like with Protestant Christianity and Catholic Christianity within China, all of the religions, the kind of major religions, are dealing with this same issue in China. This is what's behind, for example, the issues with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They are perceived as having an identity and an allegiance that supersedes their Chinese identity and their allegiance to the Communist Party, right? And so therefore, there is this cultural pushback on them, or genocide taking place to bring them into submission, right? It's about submission to what is going to be the ultimate power in the country, And so, and this is happening with Buddhists as well. This is, again, what's very much behind the conflicts between the Communist Party and the Tibetan Buddhists. But even, apart from Tibet, there are stories of temples in China, Buddhist temples in China, that had never raised the Chinese flag until 2018. And in 2018, they finally, for the first time in 1500 years or whatever, raised the Chinese flag and played the national anthem. And so this is something that's taking place, across the religious landscape in China. I think this is also an interesting question of, though, as how is the Christian response different? How is the church responding to these pressures, to these demands differently from other religions within China? And it's, and again, it comes down to our questions of loyalty and allegiance. And again, that's another area where I think there are applications outside of China. Americans struggle, maybe not in the same ways and to the same degrees, but who could look at Americans and not say that we also struggle with our identity as Americans? And it's always a temptation to put our American identity above our identity in Christ, and we need to be constantly reminded of that struggle as well. Thankfully, that's not something that will get us, put in jail. But in our hearts, we struggle with these things. We struggle with that sense of allegiance and identity. So
this is what I love about this book, is it does bring this idea of allegiance to the forefront, and it confronts you with that reality, and it gets you close to a place where, as a Westerner, I mean, I am questioning, and I'm reading that question. It's interesting, though, that he's not writing with at least as not that I'm aware of, with the Western church as a backdrop. I think he has it in his mind in different parts. You can see that he has it there, but he's really writing to what he sees as the abuse by his own culture and his own government, which if you can take those concepts and move them over and then place them down on our own, I think there would be some massive overlap of conviction. And this is one of the reasons why Apollos Watered exists with our missialistic approach, is just bringing this idea out so people can see and fulfill the mission of God where they are with all of who they are, not realizing that the culture has shaped our faith in such a way that we can't oftentimes see the Christ of Christianity. We have an Americanized Jesus, and we need to see Jesus for who he is. Let's talk about Wang Yi's arrest here for a moment. You mentioned that earlier, because the book kind of leads to that as the crescendo. Right at the very end, you're left with the writing, and then he's arrested, and then either some other leaders have their writings, and they're after their arrest. Take us through that for a moment.
To talk about his arrest, it's probably best to talk about the summer before he was arrested, to begin. So, as I said, in early 2018, in the winter of 2018, these new religious regulations began to be put into place. Early in 2018, one of the large churches in Beijing was shut down. It made a lot of headlines around the world. It was a massive event, shutting down this church. In the summer of 2018, so Early Rain every year commemorated the anniversary of the Sichuan earthquake. And they did this every year. And basically that summer, Wang Yi was arrested leading up to the church's memorial service, basically, that they would hold. And that arrest only lasted for 48 hours. But it was a pretty good warning sign that more was coming. And I would say the whole rest of that year, um, anyone who knew Wang Yi or followed Wang Yi was pretty much anticipating that a larger arrest or kind of more significant arrest was going to happen and was going to come. And so, and he certainly knew that. He very much anticipated that he was going to be arrested and probably spending some significant time in jail. In the fall of 2018, he wrote My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience and gave it to the leadership of his church and basically said to them, if I'm held for longer than 48 hours, this is my statement, release it. In China, you can be held up to 48 hours on kind of an administrative arrest. And then if you're held beyond 48 hours, you're going to be going through the whole process. So on December 9th, he was arrested and his wife was arrested along with him. It's pretty common practice that wives also receive harassment or some form of arrest at some point. It really mostly so that they can't speak out publicly while their husband is in trial or undergoing trial. So his wife was also arrested. And then basically over the course of the following weekend, I think it was a Friday night, if I remember correctly. I'd have to go back and look, but it was over the course of a weekend that all of the pastors and the elders for Early Rain were also arrested. And then it became clear that it was going to be a much, much bigger event even than that, because there were just hundreds of officers, police officers, and authorities involved. And they went in. Early Rain, as I said, was pretty large, and they actually had a couple of floors in an office building that they used as their space. And so they had a very large library. They had all these meeting spaces, and all of their space was shut down. All of their property was confiscated. Their bank accounts were frozen and confiscated. And then over the course of the following weeks, eventually they basically continued to arrest people, and eventually roughly half of their members had been arrested in some shape or form. A lot of them were arrested for short periods of time and released. Some were held much longer. A lot of them were sent back to their hometowns. So in China, you don't really have freedom of movement, you could say. Basically, they have a registration system, so that it's kind of like a housing permits system where so like I could move to New York City freely, and if I had the financial means to stay there, then I could just stay there indefinitely. In China, if you're from Chengdu and you wanted to move to Beijing, you would have to officially transfer your registration to Beijing. And you can only do that if you have a reason to do so, like a job or, I don't know, whatever would give you an official reason for going there. But how this plays out is that if you move to another city without that registration being transferred, you don't have access to social services. So your kids can't go to the schools. You don't have access often to things like medical care. There are a lot of things that are restricted if you are living outside of whatever your official registered city is. One of the things that happened with a lot of early Rain's members was that anyone who was living in Chengdu, or a lot of people who were not from Chengdu originally, were sent back to their hometowns and essentially kind of forcibly removed as a way to try to disband the church, essentially. And there were a lot of really hard things that continued to happen throughout that year. A lot of people were under essentially house arrest, or a lot of people lost out on their property, or like landlords would kick them out. A lot of people had to keep moving several times due to pressure from the authorities. So it really was an ongoing difficulty and time of suffering and persecution for the members of the church. Wang Yi's statement was released as he had wished 48 hours afterwards. And I, had the privilege of helping with the translation to get it into English. And we shared it, and it was read by a lot of people around the world. We have a very little blog, and that had a lot of people reading it. And then it went on to be translated into many other languages as well. For a lot of people, that's when they first heard about Wang Yi. A lot of people that I talked to, that winter of 2018 is kind of where they first heard about something that was going on in China, or the situation of the house churches in China. And a lot of people have read his declaration of faithful disobedience. So he was sentenced to 9 years in jail in December of 2019. And that is the longest jail sentence given to a house church pastor, really since the early days of the existence of the house church, really since the Cultural Revolution. So it's a big deal, very significant. And his wife was in jail for a year. She was released after his sentencing. And then she has essentially been under house arrest with their teenage son since then. And so she still has it's not even limited. She really has no contact even today with their church. Or much of the outside world. Yeah. So we don't know a whole lot about her situation. We know she's out. We know she's, well. But
and what do we know about
very limited contact? So
what do we know about Wang Yi?
Not much. So this is the 4th anniversary of his arrest. So he is almost halfway through his sentence. There's not a lot of information out there about how he's doing. The picture you mentioned, the picture on the book, that is the only picture that is out there of him that actually is him in his jail cell. And so, we know he seems to be in good health and doing okay. But there's not really a whole lot of more information beyond that. I believe his wife has visited him once, which was a big cause for celebration.
So, Hannah, what can we take away from this? I mean, to pray, yes, but what else can we do now besides just hearing this? Like, I like to tell people, because we're watering their faith, like, here's your water bottle for the week. what's the water bottle that we can get people to sip off of with this book?
Yeah. Well, the obvious ones are to pray for China.
Yeah.
Pray for the pastors there. I always say they aren't heroes. They are normal people like you and me. I think sometimes it's tempting to make people who experience persecution into these kind of superheroes who have this like superhero faith, you know. But people fall all the time under pressure, you know. And the house churches, you know, they don't have some magic that we don't have, you know. So pray for them. They need a lot of prayer. And they will, anytime you ask them how we can help them, they say, pray for us. They are much more faithful and diligent in prayer than we are by leaps and bounds. So it's a privilege to pray for them. They pray for us. So we need to remember them in prayer. But I think I would say, if I was going to give someone just like the question to mull on for the week, it's really this question of, you know, where is your highest allegiance? What is your highest love in this life? And what is keeping that from being Jesus? You know, like what in your life is keeping you from giving your highest allegiance to Christ, you know? And that's something everyone has to ask themselves, you know, and something that I think Americans need to reflect on and need to let the Holy Spirit convict us on, you know. And you know, the follow-up to that is, you know, if Christ is your king, you know, what do you need to be afraid of? There's nothing to be afraid of, you know. Like, I think that's the main thing that I always feel really convicted of when I'm, you know, talking with these guys. It's just like, they're not fearless because they're amazing people. Like, they're fearless because they really have a deep understanding of the fact that they're in Jesus's kingdom, and they have nothing to fear because of that, you know. And that is what gives them courage. It's what gives them, I think, a posture of repentance. That's something we didn't even talk about, but they imbibe such a posture of repentance. And I think that's what motivates their love for their neighbors and their cities, is knowing who their king is ultimately. So.
Well, and how can people follow you? Keep up with what you're doing at the Center for Public House Theology.
Yeah. So the best thing to do is just to either follow us on social media. We're just House Church Theology on all the different platforms. But we have a website. It's just housechurchtheology.com. We have a lot of standalone essays and articles there that we've translated from Chinese pastors. And you can get on our mailing list there. We have so much that we are rolling out in the coming years. We're new. We're only like 2 years old, technically.
Hey, we're the same age.
Yay!
We're the same age. We're going to age together, Hannah. That's the plan.
So yeah, we're small and young, but we have a lot going on. And we probably, if you get this book and you read it, or if this conversation is inspiring, I would definitely check out the other stuff we've got and follow us, because we're looking at probably having at least one book coming out every year for a long while. So
cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, it's an important work, that's for sure, because I know God is doing a work there, and I know he's using that work to touch people around the world. And as we have said, we're New the West. Part of that key is helping us to engage one another across our cultural barriers, to encourage one another to fulfill the purpose and mission of God that he has for us where we're at. So thank you for your time, and thank you for this book. I would recommend those who haven't got it yet. It just came out. I mean, as we're doing this, we're recording this in December. It'll be released in January, I believe. But it just came out in December. So this is a brand new book, and a lot of good reviews already. People coming out and tremendously encouraged and challenged by it. But I would recommend it. Hannah, thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
Thank you so much for having me.